Sandra, didn't ask me the story, so it's not important. But
all right. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Greg Ennis. He's the former Vice President of Technology, the Wi-Fi Alliance, and author of the book Beyond Everywhere. Thank you, Greg, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you.
And looking forward to the presentation.
Great.
Thank you.
So this is a really interesting audience. We've got a combination of students, I believe, and some real grizzled veterans of the Wi-Fi.
OGs. Over here.
So if everybody enjoys this, I've really hit the mark. Then.
And if he starts bullshitting, we'll call his bluff.
You will. No, I made you promise that you wouldn't.
You did.
Okay, I'm going to talk about Wi-Fi past, present, and future. First, some thank yous. Thank you to Santa Clara University for hosting us here. Thank you to Behnam Dezfouli for inviting me and setting this up. And thank you to the IEEE Communications Society Santa Clara chapter for posting this on their website. So, as you were just told, so I have written a book. It's called Beyond Everywhere: How Wi-Fi Became the World's Most Beloved Technology. And so for many years, I have believed that the Wi-Fi story was way more dramatic and interesting than people outside the Wi-Fi industry knew, and even more dramatic and interesting than people within the Wi-Fi industry knew. And so, writing a book like this has kind of been on my mind for a fair number of years, and I retired in 2016, and that gave me the opportunity to work on this. So I've always felt that someone needed to write this book. Why me? So let me just introduce myself here. So I was privileged to have a front row seat at the center of the Wi-Fi industry for over 25 years. I was the author of the 1993 DFW Mac technical proposal. We'll be talking about this, along with two co-authors. And that technical proposal was adopted by IEEE 802.11 in 1993 as the foundation for the standard. And subsequently, right after that, I became chief technical editor of the original standard. This is the original 1997 version of the standard. Very obsolete now, probably, but still a very pretty color. So I was chief technical editor of that. So during the process of developing that final text, I was very involved. But then along with a handful of colleagues, one of whom is here, Jeff, we founded the Wi-Fi Alliance in 1999. And I served in that organization's lead technical position for 16 years. I retired in 2016 as the vice president of technology for the Wi-Fi Alliance. So I really have been privileged to have this seat over this time, and it seemed to me that I was pretty well positioned to write a book that covered the whole story, not just part of the story, but the whole story. And so the book just came out in July. So my talk is called Past, Present, Future. I want to talk about the present first. This number is probably obsolete. This is the number that's in the book, but it's probably over 20 billion now. But we'll just say over 18 billion Wi-Fi devices in operation worldwide. 4 billion additional devices sold each year, and it supports over half of all internet traffic. The global value of Wi-Fi in a study that was done by Telecom Advisory Services in 2021, 3.3 trillion, expected to grow to 4.9 trillion in 2025. So, Wi-Fi is very valuable to the world's economy. And I can prove that here. My daughter, who happens to live in Paris, she's visiting, and she just gave me this as a gag gift. This is a greeting card from France, and the greeting card says, I can't speak French, but it says in the English translation, which do you prefer, having gold or Wi-Fi?
It's such a good card for you.
So and it's blank inside, so I have no idea what the origin of this card is, but at least in France, they think of Wi-Fi as being comparable to gold. But so it is very valuable to the world. So think about Wi-Fi. It's in every environment. By that I mean home, office, factory, agriculture, restaurants, public hotspots, every environment. It's in every country. It's in every type of device. And by that, I don't just mean, it's in thermostats and, things like that, but that it's in devices by all the different manufacturers. For example, there isn't an Apple wireless LAN and a non-Apple wireless LAN that doesn't communicate. In each one of these dimensions, at various points in the Wi-Fi story, it was possible that the wireless LAN industry would have fragmented. It's possible that we might have ended up with a different wireless LAN in the home versus the office. It's possible that we might have had a different wireless LAN in the United States versus China. It's possible that we might have had a different wireless LAN for Apple devices and for other devices. So Wi-Fi is not just a wireless LAN, it's the wireless LAN. It ended up being the wireless LAN universally. There's a universality to Wi-Fi. And so the Wi-Fi story is not a story of how the technology developed. It's a bigger story than that. It's not just about technology, it's a story about how a particular technology became a universal language. It's a story about the people and their organizations, because that's really the interactions and the collaboration and the competition among various organizations and the battles within the people and the cooperation among the people who were working on all this. That's what ended up allowing Wi-Fi to become this universal language that it is. So among these types of organizations that we'll be talking about, regulatory agencies, individual companies, standards organizations, ad hoc alliances of companies. You'll see that there's various points in this story where ad hoc alliances of companies working together without necessarily having a formal connection turns out to be very important in the development of Wi-Fi. And then trade associations, obviously the Wi-Fi Alliance, but other trade associations as well. So past, present, future. I just talked about the present. Let's talk about the past. So here's the original invention of Wi-Fi. Anybody recognize that name? Well, I'll show you her picture.
Hedy Lamarr.
Hedy Lamarr. Glamour movie star back in the 40s, I guess, or earlier. Yeah, 40s. So Hedy Lamarr is sometimes called the inventor of Wi-Fi. This is actually a US government document from the National Archives called Pieces of History, the World War II era actress who invented Wi-Fi, Hedy Lamarr. So here's her actual patent, secret communication system. And if you look down here, she talks about a pair of synchronous records, one at the transmitting station, one at the receiving station, which changed the tuning of the transmitting and receiving apparatus from time to time. Well, that's called frequency hopping. So you can say, although this is disputed by some experts, that Hedy Lamarr invented frequency hopping. Now, frequency hopping is a spread spectrum technique. And the way it works is by hopping around a predetermined sequency of frequency. I didn't catch that. I'll have to fix that. A sequence of frequency channels, the signal is spread over a wider frequency range. Now, the initial application of this, and in fact what Hedy Lamarr had in mind with her patent, was to make the remote control of torpedoes during World War II less susceptible to jamming. And it ended up having other applications for secret communication within military applications. But so Hedy Lamarr can be said to have invented frequency hopping. And in fact, if you look here in this figure, up at the top, you see what looks like a piano roll of an old player piano. It actually is a piano roll of an old player piano. That was the way that they talked about building a prototype. And so you can see these different, let's see if so, you know, as the roll goes through, these different holes in here would indicate what frequency the thing is going to be jumping to, I think. So Hedy Lamarr can be viewed as the inventor of frequency hopping. But there's another spread spectrum technique, direct sequence. That's the other major spread spectrum technique. The way direct sequence works is it encodes each data bit into a code word that consists of multiple, think of like smaller bits called chips. You're going to see in a second why this is all important. But here's a direct sequence example. This happens to be the way that direct sequence was implemented within the very first 1997 version of the IEEE 802.11 standard. The actual data, well, whoopsie. The actual data up here, of course they say scrambled data, so it's already gone through some kind of a scrambler. But you've got zeros and ones that you want to transmit as your data. Those are encoded by XORing them basically with a particular sequence that was called the Barker sequence. And so the actual transmitted signal ends up being this higher frequency signal, consequently requires a wider spectrum in order to transmit. So you're essentially, you know, you're transmitting data at a lower data rate than you otherwise could because you're encoding it within this Barker code. But this is also a technique of taking the original signal and basically spreading that signal over a wider set of frequencies. And that has benefits in interference mitigation. And I mean, it also has benefits, especially the frequency hopping, in being more difficult to jam, but that's not really going to be important as we get into discussing this within Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi originated as a direct sequence technology, not frequency hopping. So Hedy Lamarr did not invent Wi-Fi. Frequency hopping was incorporated as an optional transmission technique in the original 802.11 standard, but that original standard, this 1997 version here, this is not Wi-Fi. This is 802.11, but Wi-Fi didn't happen until a few years after this was published, when the 802.11b enhancement to the original spec came out. That's the thing that was called Wi-Fi. So although frequency hopping was incorporated into 802.11, you can't say that Hedy Lamarr invented Wi-Fi. But it is true that the necessity of supporting frequency hopping did influence the design of the 802.11 protocol, MAC protocol. So there was an impact that Hedy Lamarr had on it, but I think we need to write to the National Archives and ask them to correct this.
Revisionist history.
Yeah. Okay, so this is why these two spread spectrum techniques are important. In 1985, the FCC came out with a report and order adopted May 9th, 1985. And you can see the first three words are spread spectrum modulation. So this report and order turns out to be extremely important for our story. The elements of this 1985 ruling, it allowed devices to transmit without a license in certain bands. So, you know, some of the frequency bands require licenses, like a cellular phone company. They have a license to have exclusive use of certain frequencies in a certain geographic area, or a radio station. broadcasting over the air, uses a particular frequency band limited to a certain geographic area. The 1985 report and order from the FCC essentially deregulated some bands to allow for devices to transmit without a license in certain frequency bands. And the two frequency bands that are important are in the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz part of the spectrum. Another important element was that it required low power. These devices could not transmit like a cellular transmit tower. They had to transmit at very low powers. And of course, you see that, the two types of devices that are most prevalent today that are taking advantage of this are Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, both of which are very limited distance. That's because the FCC requires that things be transmitted at low power levels. This is obvious because without a license, if you're transmitting in a high power, you're just going to interfere with more potential people. I should point out, I'm talking about the FCC, but the other regulatory agencies around the world basically adopted the same or very, very similar regulations. And so this ended up being a global regulation that allowed for a global industry to be initiated. And then the third key aspect of this 1985 ruling was that any device that's operating in these frequencies must use one of two spread spectrum techniques, either frequency hopping or direct sequence.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What pushed the FCC to make this ruling?
I'm sorry?
Why did the FCC make this ruling? There must have been some push.
Why did the FCC do this? Because the FCC, like regulatory agencies around the world, I think they do legitimately try to do things for the benefit of their citizens. And I think they saw that there was the potential of products, new types of products coming in that would take advantage of this, that people would want. And of course, that proved to be true, way beyond their wildest dreams, with 18 billion Wi-Fi devices and, yeah, Ken?
The story's not widely known, but the FCC was widely lobbied by HP in the mid to early 80s. And HP invented actually a spread spectrum system that they actually had about 100 kilobits. Their model was it would go through the entire radio frequency spectrum.
What DC to daylight?
You spread wide enough so you're below the noise floor of everything. They got rammed by CBS. Broadcast television station said, this ain't going to happen.
Yeah.
And then that led to the report order.
Yeah. There was an engineer named Michael Marcus who was at the FCC who was instrumental in this. Yeah, there was a question?
I had a general question. I mean, you typically in all this communications, like you had different standards like GSM, CDMA for like different parts of the world. How come this became something that was globally accepted? So what was it that made that happen?
So that's a big part of the story. What became worldwide very early were these regulations from the regulatory agencies. But that didn't necessarily mean that you were going to have a worldwide standard take over like Wi-Fi did. And in fact, although I'm not going to talk about this at all today, but there was a very intense period back around 2005 where China was disallowing Wi-Fi because they had a competing national technology that they wanted to promote. And ultimately, through a lot of effort, that effort on the part of the Chinese government was unsuccessful. But that's an example of how you could have had different standards take effect in different parts of the world. But the fact that Wi-Fi is worldwide, that's a story about a lot of effort on the part of a lot of people to ensure that. It wasn't just the fact that the regulations allowed these bands to be used. that didn't ensure that you were going to have just one wireless LAN that really took off.
The hyperland in Europe, right? It was
Right.
hyperland and yet another similar but different
Right.
technology
Right.
standard.
So the very first FCC approval was for a product called the RLAN, I think the RLAN 450, from a Canadian company called Telesystems SLW. This product, you could hook a computer up to it. It probably had an RS-232 connection on it. I don't know. $1,500. And the interesting thing, Telesystems was later bought by a company called Telzon. This is going to be a theme through this. You're going to see that these companies get bought and merged and changed names throughout this. It's kind of hard to keep track of everything, but Telesystems got bought by Telzon, then that part of the Telzon business got spun off into Aeronet, and Aeronet ultimately got bought by Cisco, and so we're kind of talking about the predecessor to Cisco's wireless LAN product line, which of course has been one of the huge successes, one of the big successful companies in Wi-Fi. So here's somebody else who was a wireless LAN pioneer. I'll bet Ken knows who this guy is, but anybody else?
Australian guy.
No? Okay, I'll give you a hint. He's an inventor. He's most famous for inventing this.
Oh, it's Brown.
No?
Oh.
Gerard O'Neill.
Yeah, he's Brown University. Brown University.
Oh, Princeton. No.
Princeton. Well, close.
Yeah, East Coast. So he was a Princeton physicist who is most widely known, almost universally most widely known, as a visionary about human colonies in space. This thing here is called the O'Neill cylinder. But he also, in fact, there's a documentary out right now about him, and all it talks about is this aspect of his life. But back in the early 90s, he had a company called O'Neill Communications, and they had a product called LAN, Local Area Wireless Network. And this is an example of their ad saying, we may not have developed the first wireless network, but we did make it practical for the office. So Ken, if I had your ad, I would put that up. So by the early 1990s,
It's a much better Mark's use case.
So by the early 1990s, various products were FCC approved and on the market. Proxim, Agilis, Symbol, NCR, Telzon, all of these companies had products on the market. And were FCC approved. It took like 4 or 5 years for companies to be able to take those FCC regulations and to really build real products. But once that started, then companies started doing that. So this is a very complicated chart that I cribbed from somebody else, and I've edited it a little bit. I just want to point out we're going to be talking about company names. And the industry has gone through a tremendous amount of mergers and acquisitions and all of this. But there's only a couple of these transitions that are important to us. One of them is that NCR became incorporated into Lucent Technologies back in around 95 or something. And Aeronet, which is, I was talking that Telzon, that first product, they got incorporated into Cisco in 1999, I believe. But those are the only two. But you'll see I'm going to be talking about a lot of these companies, and many of these companies don't exist as entities anymore. They've been absorbed into other things. So I want to point out something about these products that were on the market at this time. And you can kind of see it when you look right at the logos. If you look at that Symbol logo, you see the red line and the squiggle and the O. That represents a laser barcode scanner. The Telzon symbol also indicates laser barcode scanning. The NCR, National Cash Register, their big interest was very much focused on things like retail warehouse applications. So in other words, this is actually the kind of device that was most intensely developed for wireless LANs back in the early 90s. This is before any standard, before Wi-Fi. This is the very first types of products. It was laser barcode scans. This happens to be symbols. So, and that brings up an important point about the early part of this, the early structure of this industry. And we use the terms vertical versus horizontal markets to talk about this. By the year 2000, the wireless LAN industry was focused on what we call the horizontal market of, general purpose computers, the kind of market that we think of today, connecting devices that were just general connectivity. But initially, in the early 90s, the focus was on wireless LANs that were tailored to a very specific application. And those are what we called the vertical markets. So keep in mind, this is before the internet was pervasive. This is before DSL. So the kind of standard wireless application that we think of within our homes of connecting our devices, our wireless devices through an access point, through a router to connect to the internet, that wasn't something that was happening in this time. So instead, companies were building these wireless LANs to satisfy a particular niche application. And wireless barcode scanners was a good example. And three of those companies I told you, Symbol, Telzon, NCR, they were all involved in that. Another example is wireless financial trading terminals. And that brings us to the Chicago Board of Trade. So the Chicago Board of Trade is a commodities trading floor in Chicago, obviously. It's where pork bellies and orange juice futures get traded, but also things like euro options, financial securities and things. But historically, it's been focused on trading commodities. So this is what the trading floor looks like at the Chicago Board of Trade. And I just want to call your attention to this guy right here. This guy, his name is Dietrich Volk, but you see by his thing here, he had an alias when he was there. His alias was Peter Vogel, because he was actually an undercover FBI agent. And you're going to see what this has to do with the Wi-Fi story in a little bit. He was an undercover FBI agent. Here's the New York Times headline about FBI commodity sting. And it wasn't just at the Chicago Board of Trade, it was also at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And this FBI sting operation was called Operation Sour Mash. In 1989, targeting corrupt commodity traders at the Chicago Board of Trade and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And this resulted in indictments and convictions, people going to jail, big financial penalties. And so it was a big deal. I mean, big enough to make the front page of the New York Times. But in retrospect, this isn't the most important thing about that FBI sting operation, because the most important long-term impact was that the federal government forced the exchanges to replace their fraud-prone manual system with a network of wireless terminals. And so here's a picture several years later of these guys using these wireless terminals. By the way, both Ken Biba and I worked on this project. And so this was really a major early, very early, we're talking about 1990, wireless local area network, and quite a large one, quite a big project. And it turned out that project was a major progenitor of what came into Wi-Fi. Many of the ideas that later found their way into the development of the Wi-Fi protocols came out of this project. many of the people who worked on this project ended up being very involved in the development of Wi-Fi. Do you know Carolyn Haida? Carolyn Haida was with Spectrix. They were the losing bidder to our team. So this was an example of one of these vertical markets where wireless LANs were being built specifically to target a very niche application. So I want to talk about NCR a bit because they're a very important player here. Okay, NCR is National Cash Register company based in Dayton, Ohio. They have been going for 100 or more years, but they back starting in the 80s, they became a major player in the computer industry. And like Symbol and Telzon, NCR was very much focused on the retail barcode warehouse type application, but not exclusively. They also had in mind that there might be some general purpose utility to these wireless LAN products. But the core development team for their wireless LAN development was in the Netherlands, and they created a product called WaveLAN. This is a direct sequence product, 2 megabits per second. And the technology of this is very important. Much of the technology that was developed here ended up finding its way into the Wi-Fi specification, the 802.11 specifications. But to my mind, there's really a more important reason why NCR is significant in our story. And it has to do with kind of their political stance towards standardization. They could have, like many companies, like Apple often does, decided to, just market this as a proprietary network. But much to their credit, NCR took a leading role in the creation of a wireless LAN standards committee. They were instrumental in the creation of IEEE's 802.11 working group. And in particular, a person named Vic Hayes served as their chair from 1990 to 2000. So, we in the Wi-Fi industry owe NCR a big debt, is that what for their role in really kickstarting this standard and for playing a leading role in it. So that brings us to the IEEE 802.11 working group. So this was formed in the early 1990s to develop a wireless LAN standard. The structure of the standard, to this day, essentially, is a single medium, whoops, laser pointer doesn't quite, here we go. Let me go back. A single medium access control protocol on top of multiple physical layer protocols. And the multiple physical layer protocols in the first version of the standard, this one that I have here as my show and tell, were the frequency hopping spread spectrum, direct sequence spread spectrum, and infrared. And the organization of the committee, of the working group, similarly followed this structure. There were separate subcommittees for each one of these physical layer standards and a committee for the medium access layer. But a major initial goal was the determination of the MAC foundation protocol. And the big argument was between proponents of what you describe as centralized access versus distributed access. So a centralized medium access control protocol would answer yes to the question, is there a central controller which assigns transmit opportunities to stations? Whereas a distributed approach, stations would decide among themselves in a distributed fashion whose turn it is, who gets to transmit and when. So the arguments for the central controller were that, well, you can more easily provide synchronous services that require some kind of synchronous access to the bandwidth, things like video or voice. The proponents of the distributed approach would argue that these are unlicensed bands. It's unreasonable to think that any centralized controller can truly be in control of the airwaves when you've got who knows what also going on. And therefore, it's necessary to do this in a distributed fashion where occasional interference can be accommodated. So in the case of the centralized proponents, there were, after the proposals got whinnied down in a voting process, the leading ones were IBM, National Semiconductor, and Spectrix, all focused on having a centralized controller. In the distributed world, there were 3 companies who were the major proponents, and that was Symbol Technologies, who I was describing earlier with the wireless barcode scanners, NCR, and a company called Zircom, which originally started out developing PC cards attachments to wired networks like Ethernet, but moved on into developing wireless attachments for computers, for laptops. So this culminated in one proposal ending up winning the day, and it was called DFW-MAC, Distributed Foundation Wireless Medium Access Control. A very ugly name, and in fact, Byte Magazine, which I don't even know if it exists anymore, but Byte Magazine subsequently called this acronym one of the worst acronyms of the past 20 years. But nonetheless, it basically describes what it is, that it's the medium access control based on a distributed foundation. And you can see that the companies involved here, here's NCR, here's Symbol Technologies, and here's Zircom. So it was a 3-company proposal that ended up being adopted. Jeff?
Is there another acronym for DFW that was used?
It actually was a half joke because DFW obviously means Dallas-Fort Worth Airport if you ever fly in and out of Dallas. And there was a moment at a meeting where the chair of the MAC committee said his fondest hope is that the proponents of the various different proposals will meet up at DFW Airport on their way home from this meeting, and they'll get together and merge their proposals. And so, it was actually decided to call this DFW MAC before the actual words for it were developed. So it was adopted on November 11th, 1993 as the foundation protocol. Joint proposal from Symbol Technologies, NCR, and Zircom. The key elements are, so the basic access method is carrier sense multiple access with collision avoidance. Now, if you're familiar with the original Ethernet, that's carrier sense multiple access with collision detection. Collision detection is not possible in a wireless environment. And so consequently, to get something approaching that kind of performance, there's a collision avoidance scheme. I've got a chart that kind of shows this in a second. But it also, the carrier sense multiple access basic access method also includes an acknowledgement, which is kind of a radical idea for a protocol at this level. Ethernet, for example, doesn't have acknowledgements. And then there was something called RTS-CTS, which was optional as a way of increasing the ability of the devices to communicate in the presence of other stations interfering. There was time synchronization via periodic beacons, power conservation mechanisms, something you don't see in a non-wireless protocol, something that Ethernet certainly didn't have to deal with, because Ethernet devices are typically powered. But in a wireless protocol, putting power conservation mechanisms directly into the protocol is something that's necessary to support battery-powered devices, which is obviously anticipated to be a major use case for this. There were mechanisms to scan for an AP, to both passively and actively via probes, and then management exchanges. But so those are the key elements within DFW MAC. So that was a major milestone within the IEEE 802.11 development and subsequently within Wi-Fi, and that happened in 1993. Here's a simple drawing of the DFS of the CSMA scheme. Basically, the key idea is that there are these different intervals, that are enforced to be silenced, that are different lengths. This is called a distributed interframe space. This is called a short interframe space. And the short interframe space is shorter than the distributed in order to allow a subsequent acknowledgement to be able to go back without somebody else jumping onto the medium and colliding with it. And then if there's other stations that wanted to transmit during this period, they would have to wait for this period. But then in addition, there's what's called a contention window, which was a randomized selection of a transmit opportunity that would make it so that not every competing station would try to jump onto the network at the same time. So that's in rough form what CSMA-CA is. As far as the physical layer, and I'm only, so the original 1997 standard had those three physical layers: frequency hopping, direct sequence, and infrared. But I'm going to focus on the direct sequence because that's the one that gets incorporated into Wi-Fi. And this is the chart that I showed before. We already talked about it. This is basically the direct sequence scheme that got incorporated into the 1997 version of IEEE. So this is the original standard. The MAC protocol based on DFW MAC, the 3 PHY layers, 2 megabits per second direct sequence data rate, but it was clear to everybody that 2 megabits was not going to cut it. In particular, it was clear to Mark. So some kind of a speed increase was going to be necessary in order to compete with Ethernet. The problem was that any kind of a speed increase you do here has to be done in a way that abides by the FCC rules, that allows the products to be certified. And so in 1998, there was competition for what was being called wireless Ethernet, 10 megabit wireless. And a task group was formed within 802.11 called Task Group B. And the holy grail was to achieve 10 megabits while still being approvable by the FCC. There were numerous proposals that came in, but 3 companies ended up being the focus for this: a company called Microlore, a company called Harris, and then Lucent. Lucent is actually our friends at NCR. They have now been, they actually became part of AT&T and then got spun out of Lucent. So from now on, every time you see Lucent, that's the Dutch people, the Dutch engineers that were involved in the early stuff. So there were 3 proposals on the table here. And Harris and Lucent, their proposals were backwards compatible with the 2 megabit standard in the first version of the standard. Microlore was not. So that was one. There were many technical issues, many battles on this, but that was one of the big ones that sort of had to do with a market requirement for this standard, which brings us to 3Com. So 3Com was founded in 1979 by Bob Metcalfe and others. Bob Metcalfe is the inventor of the co-inventor of Ethernet. And so 3Com, their business was focused, not surprisingly, on Ethernet. What's not so well known is their role in the Wi-Fi story. And interestingly, and you're going to see they have an important role here. But interestingly, Bob Metcalfe himself was not a fan of wireless. He wrote an article in 1993. I mean, this is just shortly before DFW MAC was selected. He wrote an article in 1993, and I'm just going to call your attention to this line. Well, he says wireless computing will flop. He says, this isn't to say there won't be any wireless computing. Wireless mobile computers will eventually be as common as today's pipeless mobile bathrooms. Porta potties are found on planes and boats, blah, blah, blah. But bathrooms are still predominantly plumbed for more or less the same reasons. Computer will stay wired. So that was the founder of 3Com's attitude towards wireless. I think of this as kind of sour grapes, right? I mean, he's, you know, it's the prototype of a wired network, right? So, I mean, this, I guess, is what he thought of Wi-Fi.
You need that.
So in 1998, Bob Metcalfe, fortunately, was not active in the management of 3Com. And 3Com started a wireless LAN initiative because they saw that the potential was there to get wireless running at 10 megabits or greater. And 3Com's customers weren't going to be interested in wireless speeds less than 10 megabits because that's what standard Ethernet ran at. And besides, the Ethernet world had come out with fast Ethernet, 100 megabits. And so to compete at all, it was going to be necessary for the wireless world to at least hit 10 megabits. And so 3Com had an initiative to do this, involving to partner with some of the companies who were developing this technology. And ultimately, this resulted in a 3-company partnership where Symbol Technologies would develop a family of high-speed wireless LAN products using source technology incorporated in a chip from Harris to be marketed under the 3Com brand and sold through 3Com's distribution. So this 3-company project ended up getting called internally as Trilogy. And the reason why this is important is because this was really the beginning of what was to become the Wi-Fi Alliance. So I already showed you this slide. We had the competition for task group B. So this is the IEEE committee working on coming up with a standard for this 10 megabit stuff that 3Com and others were wanting to achieve. But in the middle of this process, there was an objection in the deliberations where Microlore is on the cusp of winning when an accusation of voting irregularities was brought forward. Very unusual in IEEE, and it was quite a controversial day. The end result of this was that the process was restarted. So even though Microlore, through a sequence of votes, Microlore was on the cusp of getting selected, because there were accusations of voting irregularities, the process was restarted. Things were put off until the next meeting, which was a couple of months later. And during that interim period, Harris and Lucent, who were on the cusp of losing, got together, put their brains together, came up with a merged proposal, and presented it, something called complementary code keying, an 11 megabit per second direct sequence. And on July 9th, 1998, the Harris-Lucent CCK proposal was adopted. So on that date now, the combination of the DFW MAC-based foundation plus the CCK for the direct sequence PHY layer, that yielded the full blueprint for Wi-Fi. So at this point now, we start to see something that we can call Wi-Fi. It's not called Wi-Fi yet, but this is what Wi-Fi ended up being. At the same time, there was a competing organization and a competing technology called HomeRF. RF, a common way of referring to radio frequency for radio products. HomeRF was a wireless LAN consortium that was founded in 1998, focused just on the home market. Remember how I said at the beginning that Had things gone a different way, we might have ended up with a different wireless LAN used in the homes versus in businesses. Well, this is an example of how that might have happened. Home RF they had something like 80 companies at the time, including Proxim, Intel, Siemens, Motorola, IBM, Microsoft, big name companies backing this technology. It was a 1.6 megabit per second frequency hopping system, competitive with IEEE 802.11. Had nothing to do with IEEE 802.11. So in late 1988 and early 1999, the Trilogy team, these three companies, who all also participated in Home RF, tried multiple times and failed multiple times to convince Home RF to adopt 802.11b, the new 11 megabit 802.11b standard, as the multimedia enhancement to Home RF. Home RF never accepted this, and this led to the decision to form a consortium similar to Home RF, but focused on 802.11b. Symbol, Harris, and 3Com subsequently invited Lucent, Aeronet, and Nokia to join with the Trilogy team to form a new organization called WECA, the Wireless Ethernet Compatibility Alliance. This is a slide from the very first analyst briefing. In fact, I think this is from a draft of that. That this new consortium of companies, this new alliance, gave to analysts. This is prior to the formal announcement of Wi-Fi, which happened the following month. But so you can see here the 6 companies here. You have the original 3 I was talking about of 3Com, Harris, and Symbol, and then Lucent, Nokia, and Aeronet, who were invited to come in and join, and those are the 6 founders of this organization. This organization became the Wi-Fi Alliance, obviously. So Interbrand was hired to come up with a name. Interbrand is a branding company. They were hired to come up with a name for this technology. You know, the name for the technology at the time was IEEE 802.11 High Rate Wireless LAN. The possibilities that they offered up included Torchlight, Trapeze, Dragonfly. So I guess if Dragonfly had been selected, we'd have logos that look something like this. But obviously the name Wi-Fi was chosen. This is a slide actually from the Interbrand presentation once the name had been decided and it was time to decide on the logo. And so you can see there's various ideas of how to signify you know, wireless in the like that one has antennas, and the 11 obviously was 802.11 running at 11 megabits. But this one here, not exactly, but that is really the germ of the idea of what we ended up calling the yin-yang symbol, which we ended up having as the logo for the Wi-Fi brand. Yes?
So what Wi-Fi stands for?
So you'll get different opinions on this. And in fact, I looked at Interbrand's opinion just the other day. And Interbrand clearly says Wi-Fi was not meant to signify anything. It alluded to hi-fi, but it was not meant to signify that the phi stood for fidelity. But clearly it was it was a play on words with hi-fi, and the Wi-Fi line, or WECA at the time, ultimately decided in the early days, because we were afraid that people would be confused about Wi-Fi, to put the standard for wireless fidelity on the bottom, which is meaningless, but and that I don't remember how long that lasted. Yeah.
Do you want a little bit more color?
Sure.
So I actually hired Interbrand. I was the 3Com person running the wireless initiative. And so what Interbrand would say is that Wi-Fi was informed by hi-fi, so high fidelity, wireless fidelity. And it was specifically Cisco that Cisco did not want to use the term Wi-Fi because they thought it was consumerish. 3Com wanted to use the term Wi-Fi because it was consumerish. Cisco did not want to use it because it was consumerish. And so they didn't want the name originally they didn't want Wi-Fi to be used because they didn't want this wireless LAN and the consumer stuff in the enterprise. And then ultimately they said they brought back the notion of wireless fidelity in order to give it an enterprise feel. So you had the first begin, we just want Hi-Fi and Wi-Fi informed by this notion of fidelity, and then you had the, no, we actually want to try and use it to give ourselves a little bit more credibility. So you had this sequencing of Wi-Fi doesn't mean wireless fidelity, yes it does mean wireless fidelity, no it doesn't mean wireless fidelity.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was longer than you wanted.
Why fidelity? Why fidelity?
Because it's hi-fi. It was a play on the word hi-fi, which is high fidelity. I mean, that's the only place where the word
It is
fidelity
something
came
with a
in.
small number of syllables, and I know 211 wasn't gonna be it.
Yeah.
Well, you also have to test it for how it sounds in every country.
Exactly.
So hi-fi was out there already, so Wi-Fi is a small extension to it.
Right, and in France, it ends up being pronounced Wi-Fi.
We yeah, same in Italy.
And actually, one last point. Actually, one of the things, when you do your own startup, if you find out, one of the hardest things to do is figure out names. You get the biggest arguments.
Yeah. Okay, so then WECA, the Wireless Ethernet Compatibility Alliance, ultimately changed their name. Now that the name Wi-Fi had been chosen, and it took, I think, a year and a half or more before this happened, but changed their name to the Wi-Fi Alliance, and that's the Wi-Fi Alliance.
Okay, that was also with Cisco. Cisco didn't want to move the wireless Ethernet.
Okay. So a key goal of the Wi-Fi Alliance from the earliest time was to do interoperability certifications. So 802.11 was getting bad press and getting dumped on by its opponents, like the people in HomeRF, claiming that it will never be interoperable. And there was probably some truth to that in the early days. And so it was felt that in order to counter that, it was absolutely necessary to not only just call these devices Wi-Fi, but to actually put them through tests to make sure that they work properly with other Wi-Fi devices. And if they do that, they would be allowed to display the Wi-Fi logo, so that's the importance of the Wi-Fi logo, and they would be able to be called, Wi-Fi certified. So this is a figure taken from an early, it's not from the very earliest, but it's taken from an early Wi-Fi Alliance certification test plan. And just to show you kind of the basic idea here, there was a test bed of access points from multiple manufacturers, and there were additionally stations from multiple manufacturers. When I say stations, these would be PC cards, PC Wi-Fi cards plugged into laptops at this stage. And then there'd be in this example, a particular station under test. And the particular station under test would go through all sorts of exercises to verify that it works properly with this AP, to work properly that it works with this AP, with this AP, with this AP. And then similarly, the APs would go through tests where they were verified that they worked properly with stations from 4 different vendors. So this became a major focus for the Wi-Fi Alliance to establish this kind of a test plan and to implement it in test labs. This basic idea is still going today. There's 12, I think, Wi-Fi certification labs around the world, in Europe, in Japan, in India, United States, China, many in China. And so the program has gone through a lot of evolution, but the basic idea is that it's still very, very important for Wi-Fi devices to get certified and to verify that they're working properly with other devices. Jeff?
Can I just say, this was your idea?
You can say that. Okay, so Wi-Fi certified, that ended up being that program. Now, HomeRF was still going. So the Wi-Fi Alliance has been founded. It's called WECA, but HomeRF is still going. And they attempted to get the FCC to approve a higher version of their frequency hopping that was called wideband FH to compete with 802.11b, because their 1.6 megabit speed of their existing frequency hopping system was not going to cut it against the 11 megabits here. So they thought they could get the FCC to approve a version of frequency hopping that they could make compatible somehow with their existing stuff that would run at speeds comparable to what Wi-Fi was now doing. They ultimately got that approval, but not within time to stem the growing popularity of 802.11b. And so HomeRF basically got canceled. The organization got disbanded. The members of HomeRF, including their promoter members, came over to the Wi-Fi Alliance. Many of them became sponsor companies like Microsoft. And so at this point now, so this is in like 2001 or something, basically there's a single wireless LAN standard now that looks like it has the potential, at least, of being a universal wireless LAN. So the Wi-Fi Alliance today has over 800 member companies. This is just a list of the sponsor companies. Today, you can see that it's a pretty stellar list of the major technology providers. So, you know, after the defeat of the HomeRF organization, the Wi-Fi Alliance really just exploded. Next part of the story is this guy. I'm sorry that this picture is so blurry, but it's a screen snapshot from a video. I hope you can see that that is Steve Jobs. He's holding a hula hoop with a laptop, and what he's doing is he's demonstrating what was called Airport, which was Apple's brand new implementation of 802.11, demonstrating that at one of the Macworld conferences or whatever in his traditional showmanship style. This was a deal that was put together by Lucent, and it was a very significant deal. The significance was, for one, 802.11 was chosen rather than HomeRF or rather than Proxim. I mean, Apple could have chosen HomeRF, but instead they decided to choose 802.11. There was a $99 price point for their Wi-Fi implementation. That was a major step, and that would have to be matched by their competitors. And it did. It led to price drops. I mean, at this point, a standard PC card for Wi-Fi was probably costing $300. And so this was a major deal. They branded it Airport, not calling it Wi-Fi. And this was potentially an impediment to the successful launch of the Wi-Fi name. That was something that we were a little worried about, of competing for people's mind share. But also, there'd be a question, would Apple tweak this into an Apple-specific version of 802.11? That's something Apple does commonly, right? I mean, Apple is very eager to have Apple-specific technology incorporated within their products. And so this was a worry that Apple would make this, they'd do something to this and it would be Apple-specific and wouldn't really be interoperable. But this answer came back just 7 weeks later. Apple joined WECA with a commitment to Wi-Fi certify their products. So that was a major win for the Wi-Fi industry. On April 17th in 2000 were the first Wi-Fi certs. The test bed incorporated products from Symbol, Lucent, Aeronet, and 3Com. Those were the kind of golden units that other devices were tested again. But this first announcement was 16 products from 8 different manufacturers, 9 PC cards, 7 access points, all interoperable. There's now 60,000. I don't even know how many. What is the number now? It's, you know, something like 60,000 certified Wi-Fi products. This is an example of the types of products that were being, this is a PCMCIA card, plugs into a PCMCIA slot in a laptop. You guys have probably never seen a laptop with a PCMCIA slot, but that's the way.
Totally obsolete.
That's the way. Yeah. And this thing is about this big. No, it's about that big. So this was Lucent's Orinoco product. You can see they proudly display the Wi-Fi logo. So things are going well, and crisis hits. And that was on January 29th, 2001. And this is the crisis that hit. This is a slide taken from a presentation by a guy named Nikita Borisov. He presented this at a conference, some kind of a cybersecurity conference, saying analysis of 802.11 security or wired equivalent privacy isn't. So what is wired equivalent privacy and why isn't it? Well, it's WEP, W-E-P. That was the name for the original 1997 encryption scheme in the 802.11 specification. The cryptic naming, if you forgive me the pun, stemmed from its goal to provide the same level of privacy protection as Ethernet. Not to provide more privacy protection, but to provide the same level of privacy protection. How did Ethernet provide its privacy protection? Well, it had no encryption. Its privacy protection depended upon the fact that it was wired and hence hard to tap into. And so the goal of the original encryption scheme within Wi-Fi, within 802.11, was to just match this level of privacy protection, which isn't much. But still, it was, and so here is basically the way that WEP worked. It used the RC4 encryption algorithm to generate a key stream that then gets XORed with the plain text to produce the text that gets, the data that gets transmitted, and then the corresponding reverse of this operation on the other side. But the intent was to provide the same level of privacy protection as a wired LAN. So Wi-Fi was cracked. And this was right as, things were starting to go well, Wi-Fi is cracked. So Borisov, Goldberg, and Wagner, they had demonstrated that WEP was susceptible to attacks, man-in-the-middle attacks and others. And this was presented at this crypto conference. Now, 802.11 was already working on a replacement for WEP, just as kind of a matter of course, not knowing that WEP was broken, but knowing that, it's just important to keep on improving the security protocols. So 802.11 was already working on enhancement, but it wouldn't be ready for over a year or more. And so this whole incident ended up having a more significant impact on the future of Wi-Fi than you might think. Because the way that this was resolved was for IEEE and the Wi-Fi Alliance to establish a working relationship that went beyond the way that they were working before, which was pretty hands-off, to collaborate on the solution. And the solution was to take portions of 802.11's new encryption protocol that was in development, was not finalized, but to take the portions that were stable enough to be able to designate them as an interim solution. And then the Wi-Fi Alliance developed a certification program called Wi-Fi Protected Access based upon this unreleased, unratified IEEE text. So that was a radical step. It was very controversial. It involved a lot of negotiation. But the end result of this is that, it was launched before the ratification of the standard. The end result of that was that this was the prototype of a working relationship between these two organizations that has continued to this day and has resulted in 18 billion devices around the globe. So it's been a very, very successful collaboration between the IEEE, which develops the core technology, and the Wi-Fi Alliance, which develops things like market requirements, but also on occasion will develop actual specifications and technology that get built into the Wi-Fi certification programs to enhance the standard beyond what IEEE might have done. So the breaking of WEP, it was a real black eye. It was a real difficult thing. But the end result of it was an organizational collaboration that ended up really being important for the future of it. So Behnam, I'm at 6:15. I'm probably going longer. Okay, I'm getting to the future slides, so I'm almost done. I just want to say, even in the past, I'm kind of done talking about the past now. There's some topics that are in the book that I didn't address today. Internet of Things, huge. At the beginning, the only things that were being certified were laptop attachments and access points. Obviously, today we've got Wi-Fi in everything. It's a major challenge to accomplish that, and to accomplish it so that things are interoperable. And so that's something that is not that I haven't discussed at all, but it's a major part of the book. China's attempt to replace Wi-Fi with a national technology. I talked about that briefly earlier. There's several chapters on that. The drama of putting Wi-Fi into cell phones. Turns out there's many different complex issues with Wi-Fi in cell phones, and there's been a dance, I call it a love-hate relationship in the book, between the cellular industry and the Wi-Fi industry. So there's a lot of discussion of that. And then also, think about your smart TVs. So my question, why is Netflix an entertainment behemoth today? Well, it's because of 802.11n draft 2.0. It's the incorporation of Wi-Fi into smart TVs that really allowed the smart TV market to explode, which allowed Netflix to become an entertainment behemoth. So I haven't talked about any of that. I just want to say those things in the book too. So let's talk about the future. So here's a chart. I just pulled this out of Wikipedia. Okay, this shows the Wi-Fi generations. And the first point I want to make is don't trust Wikipedia because these dates are completely wrong, right? I mean 1991. I don't know about the upper, but the lower dates are completely wrong. But I want, this allows us to draw some simple conclusions. Point number 2 is increasing speeds, right? Each generation has increasing speeds. And because the medium is a shared medium, when you increase the speeds, that also means you're increasing capacity. Point number 3, increasing bandwidth. Starting with just the 2.4 band, then moving into the 5 gigahertz band, now moving into the 6 gigahertz band. So as the generations have gone on, we're getting increasing sets of frequencies that are available for Wi-Fi. And that's another factor increasing capacity. One application for these newer Wi-Fi technologies that are able to support very dense environments is sports stadiums. So, and this one right here in Santa Clara is an example of a sports stadium that has put in advanced Wi-Fi, but this is happening in stadiums all over the place. And it's not just used for sports events, but for rock concerts and things like that, where people can get, they can be looking at their videos and sending videos to their friends at, when they're at the rock concert. So, that's one thing that's happening. 6 gigahertz is increasingly available. This is a chart right from the Wi-Fi Alliance that, and I don't know whether this is current as of today or whether this might be a little bit out of date, but it shows the countries around the world that have adopted the full range of frequencies that are potentially available in 6 gigahertz, those that have adopted only some of them, those that are considering further. The point being that this is happening all over the world, and there's quite an effort to get this to continue to expand. And of course, this is only what's happening on the Earth. It doesn't say anything at all about what's happening on Mars. I think that's probably a pretty green field for Mars. Okay, so point number 4 is backwards interoperability, that each Wi-Fi generation has allowed for backwards interoperability with the previous generations. Incredibly important for the success of Wi-Fi. Not all technologies out there have managed to achieve this, but it's been It's been a fundamental goal both within the IEEE and within the Wi-Fi Alliance. In fact, I can point to that decision that I talked about with microlore against microlore, where Harris and Lucent ended up with the winning proposal for what became 802.11b. If microlore had won, this backwards interoperability wouldn't have been true at that point. So this has been a very important aspect of Wi-Fi success. The industry is already working on Wi-Fi 8. It's called BN, I think, looking at some kind of nominal rate of 10 gigabits. And I just want to go back to Bob Metcalfe to finish up here. Bob Metcalfe, he's famous for three things. He's famous for inventing Ethernet. I mean, that's enough to justify his fame. He's famous for founding 3Com. And he's famous for Metcalfe's law. And Metcalfe's law says the value of a network is proportional to the square of the number of interconnected devices. Well, 18 billion squared is this. So product developers will continue to see Wi-Fi as the most attractive connectivity option. It's not going away anytime soon. So with that, I'll say thank you, and if there's any further questions. Yes.
But some people claim that private 5G can replace Wi-Fi.
5G?
Private 5G.
Private 5G.
Private 5G.
Can replace 5G in the enterprise.
So it's true that some people claim that. What I don't understand with that is that look at all of the devices implementing Wi-Fi. Are you really going to expect to see, within the next, whatever, how many years, 5G in all of those devices? Maybe, but it seems, the cellular industry has been focused on cell phones, and they do that very well for long distance communications. But to see that really, it'll be there, certainly. But I don't see Wi-Fi going away anytime soon.
I'll put something in here. I think because of the cost, it'll never happen.
That's right.
Because to get something certified, you either have to buy a module that's already certified, which means they're going to charge you more for the same circuitry, let's say. Or if you certify it yourself, you've got to submit your stuff to all the carriers or whoever's making your private 5G box for your business. And that's still a licensed channel. The 5G thing, they still have to pay for that spectrum to somebody and get it assigned to them to put it in their building, because it might radiate outside the building. And we get all these gigahertz for free. It's crazy. I don't see it.
So all of us have been marketing this shit
Oh, I got it.
for many, many years and fighting the cellular carriers who've imagined that, carriers in general, who've imagined that they can deliver data services inside buildings, inside residences, inside factories. So in my professional career now, 50 years, something like that, 60 years, they've failed miserably. Consistent measure of failure. They don't know how to sell, they don't know how to ask the right questions, they don't know how to deliver the right product. That doesn't mean they won't fail in the future, but I'd bet against it.
I think there's a role for fixed wireless to the home, where you connect to a Wi-Fi router and everything is Wi-Fi from that point.
Well, the other bit is power consumption. The power consumption of a 5G circuit is by nature way more than a Wi-Fi circuit. Well,
okay, we had a question over here.
Oh, well, yeah, no, just to add on to that, no matter how much low band, millimeter wave a cell phone company owns, they still always fall back on Wi-Fi calling for voice anyway.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah.
So, such an honor to be in the same room as you. My question is, the testbed that you built in the earlier prototyping of the standard, how did you convince all these companies to, come up with these NICs or how did you have these devices from each company that could talk to each other?
You mean in the interoperability testing?
Yes.
With difficulty. It became so. The Wi-Fi Alliance ultimately developed a very rigid set of criteria that involved for this selection process to select those devices that go into the test bed. That involved multiple plug fests where the sequence would progress through into increasing rigor, increasing formality, and a more thorough set of tests. At the beginning, it's just let's all try and see if we can work together. But then with multiple plug fests, devices would be eliminated. You'd end up with a set of devices that seemed to all work together, and ultimately it became the decision of the Wi-Fi Alliance staff organization to make the decision, and it was it could be highly political. Yeah.
Can I
Okay.
have commentary on it?
Yeah. Okay.
So, it was political, right? And as you might imagine, when we started the Wi-Fi Alliance, there were 6 companies that didn't necessarily all get along. And somebody had to pull that, and the whole basis was interoperability. Somebody had to pull those 6 companies together. Somebody had to convince them to submit their technology, and that person needed to have the trust of all 6 companies to do that, and to have the idea on how to build that progression out of it.
And not only that, why is there a need for this interoperability? It's because the IEEE standard calls out a lot of the stuff, but it doesn't call out exactly every threshold. And some things are optional, some things are mandatory, and engineers kind of everybody wants to make something a little better than the other guy, and before you know it, they don't interoperate. So that's why you have to have this interoperability testing, because everybody can read the same standard and come up with a different state machine, and it's crazy. It's craziness.
But this goes back to 60 years of building networks. If you look at the very beginning of the internet with TCP/IP, this is really built the first interoperability testing. The idea that multiple companies could build something that would work together, which is where Metcalfe's law comes from. So if you're one of 10 companies building products and yours is the only one that doesn't work with the rest, your company will fail. So it's unique in the network space that interoperability is a minimum condition to be competitive.
And it's also the silicon vendors, right? If the silicon goes into those radios, and there's a lot of emphasis for silicon vendors to interoperate. So Intel, with Broadcom, with Qualcomm, those companies, they sit together to make sure that it all works. And nowadays, for these, 11, the Wi-Fi 7, you have like 7 plug fests, each of 3 weeks at a time, people sitting in cages. It's a major operation to get it all to work together. It's becoming it started really, smallish in 11B generation, but now it's really huge effort.
So, how about the integration of Wi-Fi and the terrestrial network?
I'm sorry, I started to feedback. I didn't hear that.
What are your thoughts on the integration of Wi-Fi, terrestrial network, and satellite networks?
Well, if you look at Starlink, how does Starlink reach the devices? Wi-Fi, right? I mean, a Starlink terminal is a Wi-Fi access point that ends up.
Be Wi-Fi radio rated. I have a Starlink.
Yeah.
The Starlink router talk to the satellite directly?
Yeah, the Starlink, it's talking to the satellite, but that only brings it to your roof, and then from your roof into all of your devices, it uses Wi-Fi.
So it is my cell phone, for example, using Wi-Fi to Starlink router to a base station to the satellite, right? Mm-hmm. This is how it is.
No, it goes from your phone to your Starlink router, which is also the base station, goes to the satellite, comes back down from the satellite to another ground station.
Yeah. But today, there was an announcement that Huawei, the company Huawei, did the first cell phone which took satellite directly.
Physics. It's power, interference with around you. So it turns out that one of the reasons that Wi-Fi was successful is this idea of low power, as you point out. The fact that no one wanted the 2.4 gigahertz band, because what else is at 2.4 gigahertz? Microwaves. So one of the things that Wi-Fi dramatically succeeded in is building something that was amazingly robust because it had to. Right? And that turns out that salvation through suffering was really important.
Well, I was just surprised to see this news today because a couple of months ago I saw that some people, academic in some university, succeeded to do this, establish connectivity between a smartphone and a satellite
Yes.
as an experiment.
Yes.
But now we see it in a product.
It's an iPhone already. iPhone, it's for text messaging to send
iPhone
like
has
but it's
Well, the iPhone 14
it's an iPhone, it's in Android.
They have it.
For emergency.
The challenge is you need a huge, to make it work really well, you need a really big satellite with a big antenna in orbit. Because you still have the link budget between, the ground and the satellite. And as opposed to going up 500 miles, going 20 feet to my access point dramatically changes the physics of how it works. That's one of the pieces that I think we don't talk about enough is that there is physics. So the idea of how you do propagation, how walls work, the bouncing inside buildings, the mathematics of that are really complex. And the fact is that Wi-Fi today gets its capacity because there's one beam bouncing off that wall, one beam bouncing off that wall, and you send different information. The mathematics of that, one of my old employees, Siavash Alamuti, won the Marconi Prize for that. It's an amazing contribution. It's hidden.
Yeah,
So
question here.
did we have yeah.
I was just wondering, for the future of Wi-Fi, could you see Wi-Fi completely replacing Ethernet and even fiber in at least in enterprise networking?
Well, Ethernet is always, there's always going to be wired versions of communications technology that run faster than you're going to get wireless. I mean, so there's always going to be an opportunity to use wire when, so I mean, in a data center, I mean, where is Ethernet primarily used? I mean, it's in data center, right? I mean, it's hooking this device to that, right? Within a space like this, it's almost universally Wi-Fi that is used, not Ethernet. So, if you're asking about is Wi-Fi going to replace Ethernet, and the only place where it hasn't already replaced Ethernet is in places like data centers where it doesn't really make much sense.
AP backhaul, right? Connecting the AP flows over Ethernet, right?
Right.
So
So I noticed you guys when you guys went from 2.4 to 5.
Can you speak up?
Oh, sorry. When you guys went from 2.4 to 5 gigahertz, what was it that were you always able to go to 5 gigahertz, or was there some hardware advancement that made it such that you could reach that band at that time? Like, why wasn't it? Why could you go to 5 back then when you went to 2.4 as well?
Rolf may be able to speak better to that.
The standard was there, A and B. A is the 5 gigahertz standard, right? It occurred at the same time as the 11B standard. However, at the time, it was relatively expensive and complicated to build a 5 gigahertz radio. And even when I started my company, the first question we had, was in the time frame that 11B occurred. Should we build a 5 gigahertz only radio or a dual band radio? We started off our company saying we do 5 gigahertz only because there's way more spectrum. And then I talked to all kind of customers, 3Com and Dell, and they said, no, you need to have 2.4 and 5. And my engineers, they were so unhappy. I was the marketing guy, telling the engineers, no, you have to build a dual band radio. You're going to do a 5 gigahertz radio. Now you have to do dual band. And it added cost and complexity. But that's how the market then transitioned. And it only took the 11, the Wi-Fi 5, 8 to 11 AC. There, the Wi-Fi Alliance mandated that you had to support the 5 gigahertz band. And that really shifted the market. It took about 10 years. The frequency was there, the technology was there, it was too costly.
Technology, I disagree with you. Technology was not there, because
Well,
the
so
propagation
I
through
figured out
walls
what's in the
at 5
market for a
gigahertz,
long time. I figured
5 gigahertz barely goes through that window. It bounces.
Oh, no, it's
So-
right now, it's.
I'm the, well, we could argue about this,
All right.
but I believe that one of the major things that happened is you've got MIMO, and MIMO essentially dramatically increases the link budget. And that made 5 gigahertz essentially look like 2.4.
I asked these guys not to heckle me, but I didn't tell them they couldn't heckle each other.
Question in the corner there.
I used to be with Genesai Logic, so I've seen this home RF and 8211 battles going on. But the thing that really upset me was Caltech suing all these companies for Wi-Fi patents. So what do you think?
That's a whole kettle of fish.
So, IEEE has a policy of basically, if you're going to participate in the standards process, you contribute the patent. You agree that you'll license it on reasonable and non-discriminatory terms. Not everybody participates in that, and there have been major cases where people have ended up, suing Wi-Fi companies, or there was a case with Token Ring that was like that, right? So that happens.
Yeah, but Caltech doing that was really unimaginable. Like academic, established academic.
It's the wife of a patent troll. We've been sued by everybody, and the guys that bought National Semiconductor's patents are suing us for power over Ethernet. It's all this crazy stuff that you can't trade patents with them because they don't make anything. They just want their cash. So it's lawyers. What happens?
All right, thank you very much, Greg.
Okay, thank you very much. My pleasure.